Hello, I'm Ellie Dowding.
And I'm Lee Coates. Together we are In Accord and the Accord Initiative.
You're listening to Accord Talks, a podcast about sustainability and compliance and advice processes supporting the financial advice sector. We hope you're all well.
Before we get into today's main discussion about vulnerability, we want to start with something we're genuinely excited about. Drum roll, please. Our client preference ready badge is now live. Now, for a long time, firms have told us we do this properly. We ask, we record, we reflect client preferences in suitability. But there's been no simple way to demonstrate that publicly. The badge changes that. It's voluntary, firm level standard, process-based, and outcome neutral. I think it's important to say that it doesn't judge fund choices or performance. It looks at whether firms have embedded a structured, neutral, and consistent approach to asking about recording and reflecting client investment preferences across the firm. And it's free to apply for, thanks to our partners.
Yeah, I'm so excited about this. And it's been a very busy few weeks for sure. So please, if your firm already asks all investment clients about preferences, records them clearly, and applies the approach consistently across advisors in the firm, you will probably meet the standard. I think I have to say what we're really doing here is making good client understanding visible, not just to potential new advised clients, but to the regulator as well, due to how it formalizes processes in terms of client understanding.
That's a great point there, Ellie, about visibility. So applications are open now, and we invite you to apply. Early adopters are very welcome indeed. Woo! The links are in the show notes for you.
Okay, so I think we've got another couple of quick things before we move into the main topic. First, the Investment Association has recently published Realigning Stewardship, Delivering Sustainable Value Through Stewardship report. This report is essentially a roadmap for strengthening the UK stewardship ecosystem. And what's interesting isn't just the headline, it's the direction of travel. So the report reframes stewardship less as policy positioning and more as core capital allocation discipline, very much focused on long-term value creation.
Yes, and for advisors, that really matters. This is because stewardship is not abstract. It's how risks like climate change, governance, biodiversity, and human capital are addressed inside portfolios over time. So, if you're recommending funds making sustainability claims, understanding how those managers exercise stewardship is part of knowing what you're putting your clients into. And I think the subtext is important here. The market is moving from do you have a policy to show me the outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that this feeds directly into consumer duty expectations. If a sustainable feature is part of a product's proposition, firms need to understand how it's actually delivered, not just marketed. It's about evidencing substance.
Hmm. Okay, and the second thing to cover before our main topic is something I know you wanted to cover, Ellie, and this being the recent CP26/5, which is the FCA consultation on aligning listed company sustainability disclosures with UK sustainability reporting standards. Now, I'm very aware that this is not a retail rule change. It doesn't introduce new disclosures for consumers. But what it does do, I think, is go some way to fix the information supply chain upstream.
Yeah, that's right. That's a really good point. So to hammer that home a little bit more, the FCA is explicit in the consultation that weak, inconsistent sustainability disclosures harm end investors through capital misallocation, mispriced risk, and poorer long-term returns. So what the proposals detail is that better issuer level climate and sustainability reporting means better data for asset managers and better better data should mean better product design, better pricing of risk, and stronger alignment with target markets. And this is a big one. I think it also removes one of the excuses in the market that we hear sometimes, being that data isn't good enough. So over time, I think it all raises the evidential bar for firms claiming they consider sustainability or climate risks. So what I think is interesting is that whilst the CP26/5 doesn't change consumer duty directly, what it does do is strengthens the infrastructure that consumer duty relies on, and firms should be thinking ahead.
Great points, Ellie. Super interesting and definitely worth advisors spending some time thinking about. Okay, I think we're now ready to start today's main topic, vulnerability. Those of you who know us and our work know that we've talked a lot over the past year about knowing your client fully. We think that vulnerability sits at the heart of that. And interestingly, unlike many regulatory and sustainability related issues, it's an evolving topic. So we're delighted that Richard Farr could join us for this episode to give us a neat overview of how vulnerability is evolving.
Yeah, it's so good that Richard could join us. So, a quick introduction for our listeners. Richard Farr is CEO of Telos Solutions, which is a management consultancy. He's also chair of the Association of Professional Compliance Consultants Vulnerability Working Group, and he's a non-executive director of Comentis, which is the duty of care assessment company that delivers a digital assessment platform to identify and support vulnerable customers. Over to Richard.
Hi, Ellie and Lee. Thank you very much for inviting me along to talk about vulnerability. I wish to look at the whole process from identification through to validation and what all the different terms mean in between. So I'm a big advocate of screening customers for vulnerability. It's a bit like the attitude to risk that IFAs use, is you wouldn't think about advising somebody unless you knew what their risks were. So I don't see why IFA should not know if there are any issues, any vulnerabilities that the customer may have. So you can't just assume, you can't just let it happen. Actually having a screen in place, a bit like the attitude to risk, is an important step. So some people think, oh, that could unearth an awful lot of vulnerabilities. I think some of the stats say that half of us at some point in our lives will be in a vulnerable circumstance. But you shouldn't be too worried about that. So I know we've discussed before the concept of causative nexus, and perhaps I can just explain what that means. So just because a vulnerable circumstance has been identified, it doesn't actually mean to say that the customer is in a vulnerable position. Causative nexus means that there are other factors around. So quite a good test is the twins test. So there is a particular set of circumstances where one twin, they've got both the same vulnerable characteristics, but one twin has got a greater resilience than the other for whatever reason, so that the person has enough resilience to actually overcome whatever their vulnerable circumstance is, whereas the other may have less resilience and need some more support in terms of getting that through. So that's what we mean about causative nexus, is measuring that even though there are vulnerable characteristics, is there any additional support needed? Another good example is around bereavement. It could be that a lifelong partner at an early age has passed. Clearly that is going to have a massive effect on somebody. Actually, myself, I've just had an aunt pass back just after Christmas, and she was 101, and she had a wonderful life. But there is sadness involved. But again, in terms of that effect on me, it was a fine set of circumstances because of the background to that. So that's again a way of doing it. Now they're much more nuanced than that, and there are tools in place to be able to deliberate and feel as if there is something more to drill down with the customer or not, and to move on. Then once you've got somebody that needs some sort of support, it's actually looking at what support is appropriate. I know you at Accord have looked at the Comentis vulnerability support framework as a model. It is developed by psychologists and people that have worked in the care industry, and it gives a very good sort of perimeter of what is appropriate. And you don't need to go any further than that. So again, the Comentis system actually will identify a particular characteristic and then say what the appropriate level of support is. However, that vulnerability support framework is available, completely open source for any company. You don't have to have the Comentis system to be able to use that, but it does put a sort of a boundary around all the different types of vulnerability and the appropriate support that's needed. We talk about the 4 drivers of vulnerability. So that's life events, health events, capacity, and resilience. I regularly say to people, in financial services, we're pretty good at spotting life events and health events. Not so good at capacity and resilience. These things are clinical, and really you do need a set of tools, a bit like the attitude to risk, Oxford model attitude to risk. You've got a tool that can actually test for that. So again, there are tools out there that can actually help identify capacity issues and resilience issues. I know actually from your own papers, we talk about financial resilience, but that is only one factor of resilience. There are other factors as well. And again, in your papers, you talk around certain belief patterns that can have a very strong effect on resilience. So it's important to understand those 2 concepts by looking through a particular tool to actually be able to measure those. So we've got a new piece of regulation coming in 2027, the complaints reporting process. This is a bit of a landmark in terms of measuring vulnerability data. So although there's an advantage that the FCA is looking at taking away 5 complaints reports and merging them all into one, so it should make complaints reporting easier, they are actually measuring, they've got a new column against complaints about whether there are any vulnerable characteristics. So this is the first time we are actually seeing vulnerability as a formal report back to the regulator. And it's a well publicised timeline, it's 2027, but I urge all firms, you need to start measuring for vulnerability, particularly on the screening now, so that you've actually got the data to be able to tabulate it on the complaints report. So, running up for a year's worth of data, now is the time to actually start monitoring that. If you're not doing it or need to help, there's lots and lots of help out there. Get hold of me or Accord, and they'll tell you what to do. And finally, with my Comentis non-executive director's hat on, the market has matured now. We first of all started thinking about identification. Then we moved on from identification, causative nexus, and what is the appropriate support that's required. Then we looked at the data that came off the back of that, so you could record it for that particular customer. We're now 3 years into Consumer Duty, and very much so, we're taking that endpoint of the data and validating it back to the outcomes for the customer. So it's actually an outcomes report, so that you can test, refine, learn on the process, the customer journey, to make sure that new customers are, posing that particular vulnerability, have got the best, and you can learn and refine the support that they need. But also, we know that vulnerabilities ebb and flow throughout the same customer. So again, having a validation loop, so you can keep going, continuous improvement on your practices, is the way that vulnerability and looking at sustainability is moving forwards. Thank you very much for having me.
Wow, thanks so much, Richard, for joining us. There's a lot in that. Okay, so I think what Richard does very well is put clear water between identification and assumption. And what I mean by that is that just because someone has a vulnerable characteristic doesn't automatically mean they require intervention. That causative nexus point is critical. And I think the twins test example makes it practical. Two people, same circumstance, different resilience, different support needs. That's the mature framing of vulnerability.
Yeah, I completely agree. And for me, what's striking is how the market has evolved. So it started with spot the obvious vulnerability, and then we've moved to identification frameworks. Now, I guess that we can say we're in the validation phase, which is testing whether support mechanisms actually lead to good outcomes. And this is a reflection of 3 years into consumer duty, I think. Vulnerability should not be seen by firms as a tick box exercise. It's part of a continuous improvement. And Richard's data point about data loops matters as well. Our regular listeners will remember I mentioned this in our last podcast. Vulnerability now needs to be formally captured in complaints reporting starting from 2027. So, as Richard said, that's a 1 year lead in, but it's all got to be measurable.
Great stuff. So, Richard talks about resilience and capacity. Our next guest, Mike Head, takes the discussion somewhere slightly different, but equally important, as he challenges what happens when advisors simply don't ask certain questions.
Yeah, it's really great to have leading views on this. So, a quick intro for everyone on Mike. Mike Head is a managing director at Ethical Investors, which is an independent financial advice firm specializing in advising clients seeking to invest in line with their personal values. He's also managing director of Ethical Screening, which provides detailed and accurate ethical, ESG, and impact research for responsible investment funds within the UK, European, and global portfolios. Personally, I really like that Mike's LinkedIn profile explains that his focus and that of both ethical investors and ethical screening is and will continue to be achieving outcomes that link investors and their money to their beliefs.
Okay, so vulnerability is the thing that the FCA have been talking about a lot for the last few years. And it's very interesting how it's sort of evolved. That it started off with people feeling as though, well, vulnerability was, does the client have dementia? All of these early classifications that came out that there are events that trigger a sense of vulnerability. So it was about divorce or bereavement or whatever else it was. And as I say, medical conditions, which are all very sensible. And I think it was a very useful initiative because what it did was it made advisors think a bit more about the client. I think it's fair to say that too many advisors are very transactional, and putting them in a position where they have to actually consider the client. And I was actually at an event earlier in the week where they were talking about consumer duty and vulnerability. And one of the interesting sort of elements that came out of that was people talking about vulnerability in terms of understanding. I know one of the things that the FCA has been on about for a long time is that a large number of people that they identify are vulnerable on the basis of their lack of either financial or industry understanding, product related, etc. So that advisors trying within meetings to make sure and reinforce that the client really knows where they're invested or where their insurances are placed and that they are relevant to their requirements. And the idea of actually saying to a client, you know why we've arranged this plan, because if you went along to a client a week after you've put them into an income protection plan or you put money from a GIA to an ISA and you ask them about it, and if they had to refer back to their reason why letter, they'd be a little bit, I think it's because my advisor said it was a good idea. So I think that a lot of the evolution around vulnerability has been generally very positive and a good thing for the FCA to be focusing on. The one that I find interesting is what I describe as vulnerability by omission. Because in a world where advisors refuse to ask the question, they don't find out about the fact that by their omission of the question, they've got clients with incredibly strongly held beliefs, whether they be environmental, social, religious, etc. And if vulnerability is about anything, then when mental health as a negative impact is raised, it is about the ultimate red flag. But the reality is, if you're a financial advisor who refuses to say to a client, have you ever thought about where your money's invested? And if you have, are you bothered? If you haven't asked that question of someone who has recently been arrested for protesting against Palestine, or who is an Extinction Rebellion supporter who is so concerned about the planet that it actually keeps them awake at night and makes them unwell, the thought that they could actually have been invested and profiting from genocide or ecocide would be genuinely devastating for them. And yet, it seems as though asking that question is something that is beyond advisors. And they still insist, I hear this more times than I thought was possible, on saying, well, no one's asked for it, which is very strange because no one's ever asked for a multi-asset volatility of X and Sharpe ratio of Y with a 5-year time horizon. But seemingly that conversation happens. But the one that says, if you found out that you were investing into child labor or anti-abortives, how would you feel, is beyond them. And so in terms of vulnerability, it's very odd that the regulator thinks vulnerability rightly is a key issue, but then it doesn't relate it to morality and belief, which surely is one of the most important things because these are issues that are at the core of being for individuals who are asking their advisor. And it's quite important to understand that it's advisor. This isn't clients who are self-selecting. They are being advised, they are being guided on where their money should be invested, both financially and socially and environmentally. And then the advisor unwittingly, but sorry, lazily, is choosing not to ask a question because they think it would be awkward. So the ultimate output and outcome of that is that someone's going to be very unhappy. And that's not really what advice should be leading to.
Okay, a massive thanks to Mike for taking the time to join us. Super valuable, I think, for our listeners. That idea of vulnerability by omission is, I think, an uncomfortable truth, but necessary. It makes me think that if a client holds deeply entrenched beliefs, be it environmental, social, or religious, and those beliefs are core to their identity, failing to ask about them isn't a neutral position. And I will go further on that. I think it can create foreseeable harm, particularly where the discovery that their money is invested contrary to those beliefs could cause genuine distress. So it's very important to understand that foreseeable harm seen in this way isn't limited only to financial loss.
Yeah, and this is the bit I think that is so often missed. Many people feel strongly about issues like climate change, human rights, etc., but they certainly don't automatically link those concerns to their investments. We've said it many times on these podcasts and our wider education work. Clients may have no idea that alignment of beliefs with their investments is even possible. Imagine for a moment a person who may be anxious by nature and worries deeply about human rights issues or climate change, to the point that this may be causing them not to be able to sleep properly at night. Let's say that they have an appointment with their financial advisor about their investment, and the advisor does not ask anything about their personal views or belief. They just ask the standard name, relationships, money, etc. Therefore, the advisor will never find out about the client's anxiety, and this is the important bit, and it will probably never even occur to the client to mention it. If the client subsequently finds out that their money is invested in areas that they are worrying about, what do you think the outcome's likely to be? Will it be c'est la vie? Or will the anxiety be made worse and therefore become a potential foreseeable harm?
Exactly. I think transparency is the core thing needed in the process, and that's quite simple, really. It's inform the client what is possible, what's not possible, how and if they want their values considered. Let the client then make an informed decision on it. Don't leave them in the dark. Oh, and another thing, I think that Mike really summed it up brilliantly when he talked about beliefs being core to being for some individuals. And I really like the point about it's what makes us human. That includes our vulnerabilities, of course, and that can ebb and flow, as Richard explained. Advisors missing all of this are missing, I think, some vital attributes of knowing their clients.
Okay, quite right. Now, what strikes me from all of this is that vulnerability and sustainability have both matured. Vulnerability has moved on from identification to outcome validation, and sustainability and values have moved from product labeling to evidencing integration. And now, through a regulatory lens, they're converging.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think you're right on it. We picked up on this in the last episode. Firms need to recognise that failing to address values properly may become an emerging risk issue. This may be the compliance side of me showing through here, but if a firm systematically avoids asking about beliefs because it feels awkward, that's a process weakness. And process weaknesses are what the regulator can focus on very easily.
Yeah, and it's important to say this isn't about pushing ethical investing, not at all. It's simply about asking a neutral, structured question as part of the knowing your client fully process. Just as we wouldn't skip risk profiling because most clients don't ask for it, we shouldn't skip personal preference discussions either.
Yeah, and that keeps coming back again, doesn't it, to the foreseeable harm issue.
Mhm.
If it is reasonably foreseeable that a client could experience significant distress upon discovering a conflict between investments and deeply held beliefs, and the advisor didn't ask, or the firm doesn't have the processes in place to appropriately inform and ask, that becomes very difficult to defend. Consumer duty is, after all, about anticipating harm, not reacting to complaints.
Right, so reflecting a little now, perhaps the real message from both Richard and Mike is this. Good vulnerability practice and good sustainability practice both come down to structured curiosity. Ask properly, record properly, and reflect properly. Review the outcomes.
Yeah, I love that. I think you might have
Thank
made
you.
our social podcast soundbite there with that one. I think for me, this all comes down to the fact that for a lot of clients, beliefs, preferences, and values, however you wish to describe them, are central to identity, resilience, and well-being. So ignoring that isn't a neutral position, because it may in fact become material risk for firms who fail to adapt as supervisory expectations evolve.
Great. Okay, a lot to digest from this episode. Perhaps a soundbite there from you too, Ellie. But for now, with that, I think we brought everything in accord.
Yeah, it's been a good one. So interesting today. So thank you again to both Richard and Mike for joining us and sharing their expertise. If today's discussion has sparked questions about vulnerability, client values, the new client preference ready badge, or your advice processes more generally, please do get in touch.
And if there are any topics you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please reach out and let us know. As usual, we put lots of links in the show notes so you can read further into the topics we've covered today.
Yeah, so if you've enjoyed this episode, please don't forget that you can subscribe to Accord Talks. And of course, a very big thank you, as always, to our Accord Initiative partners who make it possible for us to spend the time producing these podcasts for you.
Thanks for listening.
We've loved it. We hope you have too.